tātou, me te nā kopono, me te kautahitanga o te tangata. Madam President, Mr. Secretary-General, friends in the global community, my opening remarks were in Te Reo Māori, the language of the Indigenous people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. As is tradition, I acknowledge those who are here, why we are here, and the importance of our work. It seems a fitting place to start. I'm struck as a leader attending my first United Nations General Assembly by the power and the potential that resides here. But in New Zealand, we have always been acutely aware of that. We are a remote nation at the bottom of the South Pacific. Our nearest neighbours take 3 hours to reach by plane, and anywhere that takes less than 12 hours is considered close. I have no doubt, though, that our geographic isolation has contributed to our values. We are a self-deprecating people. We're not ones for status. We'll celebrate the local person who volunteers at their sports club as much as we will celebrate the successful entrepreneur. Our empathy and strong sense of justice is matched only by our pragmatism. We are, after all, a country made up of 2 main islands, one simply named North and the other South. For all of that, our isolation has not made us insular. In fact, our engagement with the world has helped shape who we are. I am a child of the 80s, a period in New Zealand's history where we didn't just observe international events, we challenged them. Whether it was apartheid in South Africa or nuclear testing in the Pacific, I grew up learning about my country and who we were by the way that we reacted to international events. Whether it was taking to the streets or changing our laws, we have seen ourselves as members of a community, and one that we have a duty to use our voice within. I am an incredibly proud New Zealander, but much of that pride has come from being a strong and active member of our international community, not in spite of it. In the heart of that international community has been this place. Emerging from a catastrophic war, we have collectively established through convention, charters and rules a set of international norms and human rights. All of these are an acknowledgement that we are not isolated. Governments do have obligations to their people and each other, and that our actions have a global effect. In 1945, New Zealand Prime Minister Peter Fraser said that the UN Charter offered perhaps a last opportunity to work in unison, to realise the hope in the hearts of all of us for a peace that would be real, lasting, and worthy of human dignity. But none of these founding principles should be consigned to the history books. In fact, given the challenges we face today and how truly global they are in their nature and impact, the need for collective action and multilateralism has never been clearer. And yet for all of that, the debate and dialogue we hear globally is not centred on the relevance and importance of our international institutions. Instead, we find ourselves having to defend their very existence. That surely leaves us all with the question, how did we get here? And how do we get out? Now, if anything unites us politically in this place right now, it is this. Globalisation has had a massive impact on our nations and the people we serve. Now, while that impact has been positive for many, for others, it has not. The transition our economies have made has often been jarring and the consequences harsh. And so, amongst unprecedented global economic growth, we have still seen a growing sense of isolation, dislocation, and a sense of insecurity and the erosion of hope. Now, as politicians and governments, we all have choices in how we respond to these challenges. We can use the environment to blame nameless, faceless other, to feed the sense of insecurity, to retreat into greater levels of isolationism. Or we can acknowledge the problems we have and we can seek to fix them. In New Zealand, going it alone is not an option. Aside from our history as a trading nation, and proudly so, but even without those founding principles, there are not just questions of nationhood to consider, there are generational demands upon us too. It should hardly come as a surprise that we have seen a global trend of young people showing dissatisfaction with our political systems and calling on us to do things differently. Why wouldn't they? Where they themselves have had to adapt so rapidly to a changing world. Within a few short decades, we now have a generation who will grow up more connected than ever before. Digital transformation will determine whether the jobs they are training for will even exist in 2 decades. In education or the job market, they won't just compete with their neighbour, but their neighbouring country. This generation is a borderless one, at least in a virtual sense, one that increasingly sees themselves as global citizens. And as their reality changes, they expect that ours will too, that we'll see and understand our collective impact, and that we will change the way that we use our power. And if we're looking for an example of where the next generation is calling on us to make that change, we need look no further than climate change. 2 weeks ago, Pacific Island leaders gathered together at the Pacific Islands Forum. It was at this meeting on the small island nation of Nauru that climate change was declared to be the single biggest threat to security in the Pacific. Please just think about that for a moment. Of all of the challenges we debate and discuss, rising sea levels present the single biggest threat to our region. For those who live in the South Pacific, the impacts of climate change are not academic or even arguable. They are watching the sea levels rise, the extreme weather events increase, and the impact on their water supply and food crops. Now, we can talk all we like about the science and what it means, what temperature rises we need to limit in order to survive, but there is a grinding reality in hearing someone from a Pacific island talk about where the sea was when they were a child and the potential loss of their entire village as an adult. Our action in the wake of this global challenge remains optional, but the impact of inaction does not. Nations like Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, or Kiribati, small countries who have contributed the least to global climate change, are and will suffer the full force of a warming planet. If my Pacific neighbours do not have the option of opting out of the effects of climate change, why should we be able to opt out of taking action to stop it? Any disintegration of multilateralism, any undermining of climate-related targets and agreements aren't interesting footnotes in geopolitical history. They are catastrophic. In New Zealand, we are determined to play our part. We will not issue any further offshore oil and gas exploration permits. We have set a goal of 100% renewable energy generation by 2035. established a green infrastructure fund to encourage innovation, and rolled out an initiative to plant 1 billion trees over the next 10 years. These plans are unashamedly ambitious. The threat climate change poses demands it. But we only represent less than 0.2% of global emissions. That's why, as a global community, not since the inception of the United Nations has there been a greater example of the importance of collective action and multilateralism than climate change. It should be a rallying cry to all of us. And yet there is a hesitance that we can ill afford, a calculation of personal cost, of self-interest. But this is not the only challenge where domestic self-interest is the first response, and where an international or collective approach has been diluted at best or rejected at worst. But it would be both unfair and naive to argue that retreating to our own borders and interests has meant turning our backs on a perfect system. The international institutions we have committed ourselves